Hello, my name is Patrick Stewart, and I'm the CEO of the Library Foundation SD here in San Diego, and welcome to another edition of Overdue, a series of conversations with civic leaders that are long overdue. A topic of significant interest that we'll be discussing today is the increased prevalence of book bans and challenges to intellectual freedom. And for that conversation, I'm very excited to speak with Dr. Kim Fountain. Kim is currently the Deputy CEO of the San Diego LGBT Community Center, and Kim has led the Pride Center in Vermont, the Halstead Center in Chicago, and is a leading academic in the topic of anti-LGBTQIA+ violence. She served on the board of directors for the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault and the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. She also works with the Department of Justice's Office of Victims Crime Training and Technical Assistance Center as a subject matter expert on LGBTQIA+ violence. Kim, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the offer to come and chat about this very important topic.
Thank you. Yes, it is super important, and thank you for being here. Before we dive into that, though, we are here at San Diego's Downtown Central Library, and so maybe you can share a little bit about some of your early library connections and what libraries mean to you.
Absolutely. It was my first job. So when I was very young in early high school time, I had an aunt who worked at our local library in Massachusetts, a small town called Palmer, and they had a library with about 80,000 books in it or so, and I get to be a library page a couple times a week. So that was my first introduction to working in a library, but of course went to libraries all throughout school. My aunt drove the bookmobile, so it was a great connection.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So with the work that you do now, maybe helping our audience know a little bit about what the center does, the work that you do at the center, and what that means to the community here in San Diego.
Absolutely. The San Diego LGBT Community Center, what we do is three-pronged. So on one, we do direct services, so everything from behavioral health services to working with young folks, housing continuum that is extensive. So we do about 80,000 to 100,000 visits, units of service each year. And that's for everybody from, the 10-year-old who walks into our Hillcrest Youth Center to the 90-year-old who may need housing at North Park Senior Living. Wide range of services there. We also do advocacy and civic engagement. So it's working with our elected officials to educate them about LGBTQ+ issues, and we advocate for funding for our various programs. We are a vote center, and we do get out the vote work, so a lot of advocacy there. And community work where we might go into communities to do tabling, or we might go into communities to do, if there's a protest around different issues, so we might join the protests. So wide range of issues like that. And then our third prong would be that we have spaces. So the center, for instance, right on Center Street, it's a place that people can come on in and be their authentic self. Walk in and feel like, oh, I can breathe. I can be who I want to be. I can find other folks who accept me and value who I am. So we have those center spaces as well.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for all the work. And you mentioned advocacy, and I know that we'll be talking a little bit more about advocacy as we continue our conversation. Well, I'd like to get into the topic at hand. And before we do so, I want to run through a couple of numbers for us that I find pretty startling. Last year, the American Library Association, who tracks this, reported the highest number of book bans ever, 2023. 4,200 unique titles were challenged in 2023 compared to 1,800 just 2 years before in 2021. 1,247 attempts to restrict or ban library materials or services last year. And in 2023, the number of titles targeted for censorship at just public libraries alone increased by 92% over the previous year. Now, you and I both know that a significant majority of the titles that are being challenged come from voices from the LGBTQIA+ community and the BIPOC community. What is your understanding and your experience through your perspective of how these challenges have been able to evolve over time?
Not all that long ago, we were at a place where, diversity was valued, right? Where if we had diverse opinions or were exposed to diverse ideas, it led to critical thinking. And now critical thinking is equated with danger, right? And that moment, that shift in society, at least around BIPOC ideas and LGBTQ plus ideas and, various freedoms for women, whether it be reproductive justice, freedoms like that. What ended up happening is you have all these legislators who are bringing into the public sphere these attacks on these communities. And then you've got social media accounts that are just echo chambers of hate-filled speech about our communities. And you have different newscasters who, some have been actually made to say we're actually not news,
Right.
right?
Right,
So
right. The opinion,
exactly.
the opinions now,
Right?
yeah.
And so they have these immense platforms where they're reaching all kinds of folks who are disgruntled for any number of reasons with society and their lot in life. And they say, we're going to give you a target. And that target is going to be BIPOC folks, LGBTQ folks, women. And so you have this shift now to people who are saying, I'm going to get on that bandwagon. And then they give them the tools with which to do it. So they might say, you're going to write to the libraries to ban these books. And so you might have 11 people creating hundreds of these different, requests to ban books. And that ends up, that shifts the narrative, and it shifts how we move through the world and how we think about where we're valued or how we're valued in the world as folks who are traditionally marginalized, for instance.
It's also shifting legislatively.
Absolutely. And so those 510 pieces of legislation, those bills that were introduced last year in 2023, those send a message to folks that says, you're not safe. You are potentially going to be legislated into silence, right? Or there's going to be an attempt to erase your identity. And those are acts of violence, are state-sanctioned acts of violence. Yeah. And when the state sanctions the violence against you, where do you turn? Yeah. How do you know what's safe? But libraries are places that we think are very safe, right? They're places that we come, because we know that we can find entire new worlds at the library. We can come and get programming at the library or find that librarian who really wants to connect us to books that we want to read and that will make us feel seen.
So we're here in the Teen Center in our beautiful library, and I am particularly interested in how these challenges affect young people in the LGBTQI plus community, young people of color. What does publicly restricting access to someone's representation really do to a young person?
I always said that when I was growing up. So I had a mom who's Asian and my dad was from the States. And if something happened to me that was racist, specifically targeting my Asian identity, I could go to my mom and I could say, this happened. And she would say, here's how I dealt with it, or here's how I would address it. As an LGBTQ kid, I didn't have that, right? I didn't have those adults, but I had the library, And so what ends up happening to a lot of younger folks is we hear these messages over and over about, whether it's through bullying, seeing it in social media, seeing it on television, we hear the messages over and over, and it really harms our sense of self. And what is forming during these years? Your sense of self, right? You want to find joy in who you are. It's already tough enough being, a tween person, or whoever,
yeah.
right? It's already tough enough to hear messages about hate, about who you are, especially for young folks who live at the intersections of identity that are being attacked, right? So if I could be attacked on being a BIPOC person and attacked on being, a cisgender female identified person, and I could be attacked on being a lesbian, right? So many different fronts in which I can be harmed, and verbally or physically, right? And so what happens to these youth, right? Earlier onsets of drug use, earlier onsets of smoking, of alcohol addiction, right? Earlier onsets of risky behaviors, depression, anxiety, right? And if you're dealing with all of that because somebody is attacking the core of who you are, like your identity, right? That just follows you into adulthood. Yeah. So you have higher rates of suicidality, higher rates of obesity, you have higher rates of heart attacks and, all of these different things across the lifespan because you're dealing with that type of stress.
What I find interesting is a lot of these book bans, they try to center their bans on the content of the books, right? And so they talk about what's being read, about the characters or whatever the content is. But, we've briefly talked about this. It seems as though the content of the books aren't equaling the content that book banners and book challengers assert, and this equation, you used a phrase, this equation of queer identity with hypersexuality just doesn't match up.
Right, because it is the thing that they identify us with,
Right.
right? And they wouldn't look at somebody and say, oh, that gay person is also a race car driver, a chef, a football player, whatever it might be, right? They have a full life, they have a dog, they have a house. That's not what they're interested in, right? They only equate my LGBTQ identity with one thing, right? And my identity actually has an effect on all those other, what I do for work, what movies I enjoy, all of that. It does influence me. It's like, the same, you wouldn't deny that, in terms of being a person of color or being somebody who's working class, right? There's influences there, right? But if you're going to narrow my life, you're going to restrict my identity to one thing, which would be sexuality, right? And that's all you're focused on. It's going to seem like one mention of it is just the worst thing in the entire world,
And it's interesting, a lot of the bands, the narrative around a lot of the bands is wanting to protect children from this hypersexuality, when in fact they're just simply able to see themselves, their parents, their family, their community around them in the same page as the way that cisgender young people are able to.
Absolutely. And you see all the different ways that they have, a lot of these folks who want to ban the books and want to, erase LGBTQ folks out of existence will go to different events where women are hypersexualized, and they don't even bat an eye at it. It is, there's nothing sort of more American than, a good football game, and you've got these usually female cheerleaders in rather, small outfits, which is great. I am not, no body shaming, but they have no problem with that. You know what I'm saying? But they do seem to have a problem with LGBTQ folks, any kind of hand holding, I mean, that is flaunting it. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? And how is holding somebody's hand flaunting anything that is bad? It's an act of caring and love,
Yeah, I'm continuously appalled by these stories of some of these groups, the Moms for Liberty groups, and some of the religious groups, and they're asked, well, what character in the story was so traumatic to you that caused you to reach out to your public library or your school library and say, we need to have that removed from the shelves? And very often the answer is, well, I haven't read it that much, but I don't need my kids. I don't need my kids seeing this.
Exposed to it.
I don't
right?
need them exposed to this kind
and
of
then,
thing.
But what they're not saying, when they say things like that, what I hear is, you're a parent. You do what you need to do with your child. What you're telling me is you're going to harm the youth who are LGBTQ because of your belief system. Your belief system doesn't, however, include all those ways I just told you that LGBTQ youth are harmed and why we need that representation, why it's so important to us. You don't care.
Yeah.
You're fine with, almost collateral damage, right? And that collateral damage ends up being the suicidality rates being much higher for LGBTQ youth, especially, like I said, at the intersections of other harmed identities.
Yeah.
So.
And not just young people or certain states or certain communities, that kind of thing, that are affected by this, but I think that this kind of affects all of us, right? So what is the broader implications for, lack of freedom of expression, lack of access to diversity, and often personal perspectives, the restriction of intellectual freedom writ large? What effect does this have on society as a whole?
The reason why it's particularly concerning to a lot of folks with the younger people is because oftentimes we see younger folks as not having a way to actually counter those narratives. But for an older person, an adult, say, somebody who's maybe 30 or 40, we remember the days, when there were no pride displays, right? Or maybe there wasn't even a pride celebration. And we fought hard for them, right? We gave up our time and our money and our, and sometimes our mental health, to fight these fights. And then to see them start to get erased again, right, has an impact. Right. And it also makes you wonder, well, if this is where it's starting, where's it going? Yeah. So a lot of folks, LGBTQ folks, have families, right? And they think, well, how am I going to protect my family? How am I, what's going to happen to my kid when they go into school and they find out my child has two moms or two dads. Yeah. And then for folks who are even older, who might have been told, you need to go back into the closet as an older person in order to, to be safe at a rest home or a nursing home or with your home health care attendant, whatever it may be, having to go back into the closet is also terrifying. So to be able to come to a place like a library and be like, okay, life is still okay. Like there's the pride display. I feel seen. I feel acknowledged. I'm not going to fully lose my identity. It has an impact across the lifespan.
Yeah.
You know.
Through the lens of the work that you do, the work that the center does, what do you see as your organization's role in challenging what's happening right now?
One, with the direct services, is keeping our community safe, right, in terms of their mental health or their physical health, right, making sure people are okay. That's sort of at the base. If you come up from that and you think about advocacy and community engagement, we get out the vote, for instance. We talk to our legislators. We make certain that we bring attention to what's happening in the libraries. We just had an event where we honored librarians and library staff because we needed people to understand that there was an issue at hand and that librarians were at the forefront of fighting this issue. And that, the other thing that we do is we bring attention to allies, the real importance of allies in this work, because we can't do this alone. We need people who are going to stand by us, and leverage their power to make sure we're okay. So we help people, we educate folks, we bring the attention into the spotlight, we make certain that, like I said, we get out the vote, and we make certain that our legislators understand what we're trying to get across.
I think that advocacy piece is pretty key. As speaking of legislation and economics, here in California, particularly in San Diego, we are not under the legislative bubble that some of these other communities are, and we're certainly not being challenged economically to fund our public schools and our libraries because we do make these spaces available. But that doesn't mean that we're not immune to a lot of these challenges. I think a lot of our audience members will remember last year when the Pride display at one of our branch libraries was challenged and removed, and the community very quickly mobilized and raised a lot of money, was very loud in saying that we're not going to tolerate this. And through the support of the Library Foundation, the San Diego Public Library is able to join 4 other branches or 4 other systems around the country to create a program called Books Unbanned, wherein we create an opportunity for those challenged titles to be accessible to young people in areas largely in the South, but they're able to access our ebook collection here. For library supporters and Library Foundation supporters, what do you see as the most important thing that we can do individually to fight these bans? Is there more that we can do? Is there a grander takeaway that you're asking library and library supporters to step up to?
Absolutely, and it covers a spectrum of ways that you might want to get involved. So it could be going out to those other spaces where maybe a librarian may be fired for bringing some of this content into their library spaces, and go ahead and doing it. Like saying to folks, I'm going to tell you about the project that you're talking about, right?
Books Unbanned,
Books Unbanned, right? Like I'm going to tell them about it. I'm going to send my kid to school with 5 flyers to give to their friends or whatever it is, right? So that the person's job isn't in danger. And you can say, no, as a parent, I thought that was a really good idea, and that kind of on the ground activism can change the world and it can help change the landscape, And then there are other ways that you can do it. You can join like the door knocking campaigns of the center. We're a nonpartisan entity, so we go out and we try to just mobilize people to get out the vote. That's another way to do it. And another way is to pay attention to what's happening locally. A lot of us, we're dazzled by what's happening on the national landscape. Of course we are. What's happening locally is where a lot of the major tensions are, happening, and where a lot of the young folks are being exposed to really awful rhetoric. So what ends up happening too is that when you get people who say, I'm paying attention, then folks who may not have been so bold or would have been bold without people paying attention, back off.
Yeah.
So even just being a witness to that kind of threat against the communities is important.
There's an organizational aspect to this. I think that a librarian had mentioned to me in the last 6 months or so, the folks that are organizing these challenges, organizing these bans, they are small. It is a small amount of folks who are well-funded and well-organized. And it seems to me that that's sort of what we organize maybe around one or two issues. We need to organize together to create advocacy that ripples across our entire community.
100%, because there's that power in the numbers, right? And so, if you can get a whole range of people to say, we find what you're doing unacceptable, it makes it harder for somebody to step back and say, you're just a gay person, of course you think that, right? Or of course you want your library to do that. But if we stand together and then we get a few other folks involved, it's harder to say, you don't matter, right? Because we're all standing shoulder to shoulder saying, no, we think we all matter.
Yeah. And I think that's where we need to be right now.
Absolutely.
Kim, this has been a pleasure talking with you about all of this. Of course, here at the library and the Library Foundation, we like to talk about what happens here as more than just books, as you know, programs and services and resources and tools for people to come together and uplift their lives and really succeed. But books do remain central to who we are and what we do. And so before we wrap up, I'm hoping that you can share 2 or 3 books that have been really important to you on either a personal or professional level.
Absolutely. So it's a controversial book. There's a book, and I don't know exactly when it was written, but I would have been reading it in the 70s, and it was called Five Chinese Brothers. It was a children's book. And I loved it because it was the only children's book that I saw ever that had Asian characters in it. And they were smart and they were funny. And, I just gravitated to that book every single time. And I took it out of the library as often as I possibly could. There were characters who looked like my mother, even if they were, different nationalities. For me, I was like, nope, that is important to me. So representation matters. And there I was in the library. And then as I got older, I found, when I was in college, we read Amy Tan's The Joy Luck Club. And that was so important to me because it was the first time I had the language to actually have a discussion about a book, and my class was like, oh, we don't think that Amy Tan liked her mother. And I was like, she read a whole book about her mom. It was an act of love. The ability to counter a narrative that I heard, because I had been exposed to a lot of books that were, just that said, no, that's actually not what was happening. That was so important to me. So I love that book from college. And then when I got into graduate school, I got to read Judith Butler's Bodies That Matter, which was a much more sort of this theoretical, dense theory book that actually taught me that we're never done being who we are. We're always having to make ourselves understandable to the world around us. And in that, when we kind of slide out of the norm, if you will, there are forces that help us slide back in, right? And sometimes that's violence. Right? And sometimes it's not what we want to do, but those forces are out there. And so I've made an entire career out of countering those moments. So those are the books that really...
That's fantastic. I love the power of words.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's amazing. Kim, thank you so much. We're going to keep this conversation going for sure. But thank you very much. This has really meant a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you also for joining us for this edition of Overdue today. To learn more about the work that Kim and the Center does, please visit thecentersd.org. And to learn more about the Library Foundation, the work that we do in supporting the San Diego Public Library, and how you can become an activist and an advocate for your library and the work that we're doing to support our community, please visit libraryfoundationsd.org. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Overdue.